Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Financial Wellness and You session from student to graduate and beyond workshop. My name is Unisha Tucker, and I have the pleasure of serving as the project coordinator for Student Life, Inclusion, and Belonging at University Life. Very quickly, I just want to remind everyone that this event is a part of University Life's Graduate Initiative for Inclusion and Engagement, which promotes Columbia's commitment to diversity and the success of all graduate and professional school students, and is co-sponsored by Columbia's Student Financial Services. Now, before we get started, I am excited to introduce our esteemed facilitator. Please note this is a shortened and abbreviated bio. So Trista has achieved tremendous accomplishments and is overall an amazing resource and pair. We encourage you to look into her more in depth after today's event as well. And so Trista Kayser serves as a manager in the financial aid operations and training team with Student Financial Services. She brings over 15 years of experience to her role. She is a passionate student advocate that is dedicated to improving access, operational efficiency, and understanding through a holistic approach towards student service. Her work includes the continued development, administration, implementation, and growth of University Life's and Student Financial Services co-sponsored Financial Wellness Initiative, where she presents customized financial literacy presentations to the many diverse populations within the Columbia community. And with that, please join me in welcoming Trista.
What do you guys think you want to do?
Thank you so much, Unisha. And hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Trista, and as Unisha had mentioned, I work in the Office of Student Financial Services. With that being said, I don't get a chance to talk to students a lot unless I get a chance to talk to you this way. So as we go through this presentation, please do feel free to ask questions. I am more than happy to take them. The more questions you have, the happier I am. It means we're getting things together and put together for you the way you want to see it. Today, we're going to go through a couple of different things. First, we're going to start talking a little bit about what financial wellness really is and how that really impacts some of the transitions that we have to make, kind of whether we're going into our new career or if we're looking at maybe continuing our education. There's a couple different things we can consider and look at as resources. We can also then look at how we can kind of think about our finances both now and later. And how the information we have between those two times can work together. And lastly, we do have some information related to taxes. It's a little shortened. Of course, we can't give any type of tax advice here at the university, though we do have resources for you. And if you have questions related to that information, we can go ahead and share some of those resources so we can put you in a place where you can either find the information you need, or we can certainly show you the types of professionals that help on that front as well. To that end, if you see me kind of look into the side, it's because I tend to watch the chat as we go to try and catch questions. So I know my colleagues in University Life are here to help on that front. Please feel free to ask as they come along, and we'll take any other questions we still have at the end. For now, though, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so let's go ahead and actually get started. Sure. Not the best to do. Yes. Okay. So with any presentation that I do, I always like to start off by just talking a little bit about what financial wellness really is. It kind of seems a little strange to talk about financial wellness with those two words next to each other, truly and honestly. Finances seem a little cold, right? It doesn't feel like that warm, fuzzy stuff that we typically see in our 7 dimensions of well-being here at the university, which includes spiritual, emotional, intellectual, physical, social, environmental, and then way down at the bottom, financial. Now, with that being said, looking at those other dimensions, we can absolutely see the role that finances have in this, right? We know that if we want to have that intellectual component for us being in school, there could be a cost associated with that. There's planning that has to go into it, right? Certainly on the social front as well. And on the physical side, if we start feeling stress in relation to our finances, stress can permeate in all of these other areas, including the way that we feel physically. So it is important to make sure we kind of think of our finances in that context. Especially when we're talking about long-term planning, which is really what transitions give us the opportunity to do, right? If we're starting to make life changes, it means we can start thinking about what we hope to accomplish over time. So to be a little more explicit, Financial wellness is understood as a state of being where you have control over your day-to-day or month-to-month finances. You have the capacity to absorb a financial shock. You're on track to meet your financial goals, and you have the financial freedom to make the choices that allow you to enjoy life. So that last bullet point right there, that's kind of where the warm fuzzy of well-being and wellness comes in for me. You can start to see that, it's not just about the money you need to do things with today. It's about how you handle your money today and how you look at your resources to think about yourself today and tomorrow. Okay. Now, how do we ultimately achieve that, right? That's where financial literacy comes in. That's a set of skills that includes knowing when and how to find reliable information to make a financial decision, knowing how to process that information to make a sound financial decision, not just any decision, but one that's well-informed and supports what you're hoping to accomplish. And then knowing how to execute financial decisions, adapting as necessary to stay on track. So looking at them next to each other, right? We see that financial literacy is knowing, where financial wellness is having. We need something that bridges the gap between those two things, right? And that's the little last sentence that we're seeing here at the bottom of the slide. In addition to the knowledge component, financial literacy has an action component. And all that really means is taking the knowledge that you're able to accumulate and actually putting it to use. Now that sounds like it might be a little trivial, but for many of us, it can be really difficult to do that. There's so much that goes into us enacting change that it can be a little difficult to recognize the opportunities to do it or understand what's causing us to act one way or another. So my hope is a lot of the resources that we have here for you today can help in that capacity. All right. So one of the things that you have available to you through the university to help as you endeavor on to learn a little bit more about your finances and achieve financial wellness is your capability to utilize iGrad. If you're not familiar with iGrad, it's a free web-based financial literacy platform that you have access to as a student at the university, both now and after you leave school. And very simply, you can go and create that free account by going to columbia.igrad.com. You sign up with your school email address and you are well on your way. The best thing about it is that this information is given to you both for now and after you leave, right? It's not like you're learning a tool to how to use it that might support what you need today. You can access this as you continue on through time. And the other side of it is all of the great content that's available in there. And, we're only touching on components of it here today, but everything that's there goes all the way from money management to things like money mindfulness tools. And those are brand new. They're really kind of neat looking. And we'll see some of those today. There's things about consumer lending, even estate planning and family planning as far as finances are concerned. So there's a lot of really great information in there, regardless of where you are in the context of your financial planning journey. Okay. The other thing I can share too is they've got some things related to more than just articles. They also have quizzes, videos, they have infographics, lots of really great stuff in there. So I strongly encourage you to go ahead and make the account, especially because most of the information that we have in the session today was developed explicitly from information in iGrad. So if I can know it, I can know it. So if we want to think a little bit more about this concept of financial transitions, right? One of the things that we could look to is something called the financial planning life cycle. And this is used more on the financial planning side, or those financial professionals ultimately that kind of do some of that advising for individual people and families. However, it's a really interesting tool to look at more generally for some of the things we may experience as we go through time, right? It's a general age-based milestone measurement for financial preparedness. And it includes a couple of different periods, right? We have the starting out years, the nesting years, wealth accumulation years, prime time years, which sounds fantastic, and the reinvention years. And they all fall within certain stages of life, right? So as you see on the right-hand side of the screen, we have a section where we're building wealth, a section where we're preserving wealth, and a section where we've ultimately saved our wealth and we are relying on it for our main incomes, okay? Now, the vast majority of us are probably in one of these three areas, right? We're either starting out or getting ready to start building a family. And when we say family, it's not necessarily the traditional context of family. It's what you understand family to be. It's the notion, right? So that could be whether you're, moving into an area with other people, even if they're not necessarily somebody you're directly related to, something that's a unit that is going to be a transition that you experience, okay? And family development is much the same, except it's kind of got that kids component to it, if that is something that you're doing, okay? These all kind of fall in that building wealth stage, and that's what you're seeing with that arrow line that's going up and starting to curve at the tail end. The reason for this is as we go through time, right, not only do we start off with income, like when we're 18 years old, most of us aren't working a whole lot at that point, but we have the capacity to earn more as we go, right? Now, that being said, as we can see on this screen, some of what we experience during this time has cost to it, things like consumption and debt, right? Those also tend to happen during this period of time. The idea is to look at that in a place of balance, right? We want to think about the savings component of it too, and aim for kind of parallel lines going up so that we're not in a point where we're kind of crossing and giving ourselves a problem. Now, the idea here is this is just to prompt you to ask some questions, right? We can't think about tomorrow unless we really consciously think about today. First, where are you now, right? Where do you fall kind of in this conversation? And again, everybody's going to be slightly different, but more generally, this is a guide, right? Where are you going to go next? And why are you headed there, right? Why is very important because our motivations are important, but direction is equally as important too. We have to know where the trip's going to land us. And then what do we need to do to actually get there, right? What do we have going on now that we can look at and get to create the goals as a realistic goal that we want to achieve? And then lastly, what exactly is your finish line? That's the goal, and how long will it take you to get there? So again, this is just kind of help understand some of the things that we might experience during this period of time. And these are the ones that we're predominantly going to be talking about here today. So to start off with, whenever we talk about consumption and savings, what does that sound like? That sounds like budgeting, right? That's your income and that's your expenses. It's money in and money out. So we're going to talk a lot about budgeting today. However, it's going to be in a couple of different contexts. With that being said, we're going to go through 5 different steps, including understanding needs versus wants, understanding what our income and expenses are, defining and prioritizing our goals, looking at the concept of developing and assessing a spending plan, which is, I'm going to share a little bit more about it in a few minutes, but it's intentionally meant to be different, to the way we perceive it than a budget would be. And then actually, really for me, the hardest part, and for many people, is actually sticking to the plan that we made, right? And then making changes as need be. One of the really interesting ways to look at this process, because nobody really likes budgeting, right? Staring at numbers about how much money you have to spend on things and the resources that you have can be frustrating. I don't love doing it, but I know that it's important, right? Now, there are some benefits to doing it, right? It can feel like we're just kind of going through that experience, but we also are practicing this experience, right? And self-efficacy is extraordinarily important within the context of the way we utilize our money, right? This is a cyclical process. You're not going to do it once. You're going to do it several times as time goes on. So it gives you that chance to practice some things. And again, practice makes progress. We can't say perfect because nothing ever is. But the more you do it, the more you'll find ways to do it in a way that best reflects what serves you. And you'll have confidence that you can continue to do it. And that just motivates really strong inclination to stick to the plan that you have and to continue to do it well. So the next piece of this then, needs and wants, knowing what's important to you, right? Well, when we think about what a need is, it's really just a basic thing that's necessary for survival, right? However, even though it's a really simply stated concept, it's also very subjective, right? We're all at different places in our lives. We're all going through different things. We all have different structures that kind of create and shape our opinions and the way we perceive things, like our values and those beliefs that we have. And those can be exacerbated in behaviors that we ultimately experience later on. But in this case, we just need to remember that we want to make sure we're not too critical on understanding what a need is. We need to understand need in the context of who we are today and what makes the most sense to us over time. That also goes for who we are today versus who we were 10 years ago versus who we'll be in 10 years, right? That's the whole idea with having to assess and adjust, because we're never going to be the exact same person over extended periods of time. Now, if we understand needs to be those basic things, even though subjectively that we require for survival, that means that wants then are things we desire to make our lives more satisfying, right? And when we say it that way, it's important to remember if we desire it and do not need it, we don't have to have it now. It means we can plan for it. So we want to start reshaping our wants into goals. Now, the next piece of this is taking a look and understanding what income and expenses we actually have. To do this, you want to start by defining a period that you hope to evaluate, and that could be several different things, whether it's 2 weeks, a month, a semester, depending on your individual circumstances. For some people, if you haven't done the semester thing before, that's kind of a really helpful experience because it's extraordinarily different than the way most of us handle our finances. 4 to 5 months at a time is not typical. On the other side of that, if you get paid bi-weekly, maybe 2 weeks makes the most sense for you. A lot of people tend to utilize a month because that's often how billing cycles work, okay? From there, you want to find a way to track your income and your expenses so that you can take a look at it and analyze it, right? And one of the ways to do that is actually what we have here on the left-hand side of the screen. Though I do think I saw somebody raise their hand and we may have a question. Please feel free.
Wondering where you can find a pamphlet like this online.
Yeah, sure. So this particular tool is actually through iGrad, and you should everything in this slide is actually linked for you as well, so you can kind of go directly to everything that you need. And I will be sharing a copy of the presentation after we finish up today, so you'll have that as a resource as well. Awesome. Thank you so much. So to that end, one of my favorite things about this is actually the tool that we're seeing here on the screen. It's a really good segue. This is iGrad's daily income and expense diary. That's kind of what we're seeing at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. The idea here is this gives you the capacity to sit down. This is kind of using a Google spreadsheet or a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, whichever you really prefer. As far as that goes. But it lets you track from a day-to-day experience how much money you have spent versus how much money you have earned or, ultimately had come in, right? Now, let's say on day one, that's our payday, we would list the amount that we received in pay. And there's a bunch of different columns that represent different items, as well as kind of aggregate columns that represent different types of expenses, right? So we see income as a little bucket there, loans and support is a bucket there, because again, some of us may be utilizing that, but we also have things like home expenses, health and wellness, and then it breaks it down a little bit more explicitly, right? So it's designed to have a total of 31 lines for the 31 days that can happen in a month. And you just kind of go in and go, I spent this for this, this for this, this for this, I earned this for this, this for this throughout that period of time. And then when you're done, you get something that looks like the left-hand side of the screen, okay? It gives you a full kind of page with how much you've ultimately spent in certain areas within the categories that are listed there, right? Now, if you're more the type of person that does better with, the literal numbers side of it, that will be provided in the line items that are listed there. If you're the type of person that, and this is me personally, is a little more visual, you also get something that looks like that pie chart that's kind of sitting right in the middle of the screen, right? It shows you on a broader scale of those larger category buckets where your money is going, right? In this scenario, even though the text may be a little hard to see, I can share that that actual image is for somebody that has about 57% of their expenses represented in home expenses. Well, if we think about where we live and are, that's probably not that strange. Cost of living here can be a little bit high. Rental expenses can be a little bit high. So that doesn't really surprise me that this person could have that much that they're spending things on in that category. Now, on the other side of that, let's say that was something like debt. That would be really something that we wanted to look at pretty quickly, right? Nobody wants 57% of their expenses going to debt. Now, the other side of that, let's say that was something like your fun expenses, going out money, things like that. And that might just be a result of somebody having some extra income available. Well, looking at it this way, we can say, well, geez, man, what is that money doing for me? What am I spending this on? Is it something I want to reprioritize? So there's opportunities within this process for you. In addition to that, I can also mention that iGrad has a similar version of this that's designed to go over a year as well. It's their simple budgeting worksheet. Instead of it being a daily tracking mechanism, it has you put in what you expect to ultimately have happen with your expenses for the month, followed by what actually happens with your expenses for the month. And it lets you analyze it at the end of 12 months so you can kind of see the long range extent of the way your money has gone. Now, the next two steps first, this is when we can start setting our goals, right? We can't actually look at the goals that we have until we know what our resources look like. And that's what that previous slide does for us. It lets us know whether we're negative, positive, how much we actually have left over, or where we could potentially reallocate resources. Once we know that, we can then start actually planning for our goals. Now, when we think about goals, we want to make sure that they are kind of really explicit, right? They should be specific. The idea behind that is if you have a goal that's just too generalized, it's really hard to achieve. You need to understand the steps to get there, right? And this is actually part of the SMART goal setting method, which if you haven't heard of it before, many people do kind of in business settings. It can be really helpful for any type of goal that you're actually looking to pursue. So beyond specific, we also want our goals to be measurable, right? Certainly in the context of finances, it's really important to know how we're tracking at things. And the nice thing is by just doing the tracking of your finances yourself, knowing the end date, you have a measure of success, right? See if you need to make any adjustments or not based on the way you've measured things. We also want our goals to be attainable. In the context of financial goals, what that really means is that what you're trying to do is what can be accomplished within a realistic period of time, right? If you're looking to save $3,000 in a year for, let's say, maybe an emergency fund, just to kind of get one started. However, you only have resources that support putting $150 a month aside over the next 12 months. We're not going to get there. And it doesn't feel good if we don't, right? So you want to make sure you're setting yourself up for success at the onset. And then we also want these to be relevant, right? Now, relevant seems a little strange. You would think if you were making a goal, it's because it's something you want to do. However, we know that there's a lot of influence on us, right? We have, just like those values and belief systems that exist, there's also those immediate things in our lives that can potentially put an influence on our finances, the way that we engage with the people around us and what we see going on around us. A lot of people will make goals to kind of make their families happy, for example. The idea that is if you're doing that and it's not something really meaningful for you, you're not going to really make good progress towards it. It's easy to minimize. And then lastly, time-based. Again, this goes a lot with the concept of being measurable. However, this is really explicit to having a deadline, right? And this is important more than just measuring things. It's also important because deadlines ultimately are promises. It says we're going to do it by this date. Now, we need to be flexible, right? Things can change, and we never want to be in a position where we think that we haven't succeeded because we have to make an adjustment to a deadline. The recognition of having to do that is a success in and of itself, right? But if you don't have a deadline on that goal initially, it's just something that's really easy to put off as well, right? You don't really have an intention to finish it by a certain time because there's no deadline. So why bother finishing it by a certain time because there's no deadline? It can be really helpful in that context as well. After you've kind of gone through that process, you can go ahead and start your spending plan, right? Now, when we talk about spending plans, the idea here is we're taking the concept of a budget and putting some future components into it. Instead of it just being the in and out of our daily expenses, we want to incorporate the things that we hope to achieve and the resources that we anticipate having, right? To do that, we do want to make sure we have really kind of as accurate as possible projections of some of those expenses and income that we may receive. And of course, that can be really difficult, right? None of us can tell what's going to happen necessarily in the broader context over time, but we do have some resources to help us understand what it could be based on current and prior trends. The first of which is through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They offer occupational earning information, and they also have something called the Consumer Price Index, which is just a percentage-based understanding of how certain baskets of goods, as they call it, are changing in cost. Okay, and we also have from MIT their living wage calculator and move.org, which can help with understanding your expenses a little bit more explicitly. Instead of like Consumer Price Index, where it's in a percentage that's going up and down, these are based on an area and showing what literal costs could be. You also want to make sure you're looking at all of your resources, right? So if we're going to a place where we're going to be kind of maybe starting our professional career and we're looking at job offers, maybe we've even accepted one already if things went really well, look at some of those employer benefits that you have. The reason I say that is there's lots of really good things that employers do in some instances that can potentially be a benefit on your financial component, right? For example, your insurance costs, right? Depending on how you chose your insurance, if it's something you have access to, can really change the way that your expenses are in relation to your healthcare. The other side of that is there are some employers that offer repayment benefits for things like student loans. It's not something that everybody does, and I can't say that everybody will at any point, but the idea is to make sure you look at some of those things that are available. There may be services that can help reduce your overall costs, right? And you also want to make sure you're thinking about the relationship between time, value, and money, which we're going to touch on in a few towards the end of the presentation, I should say. But the basic idea here is that the money you have is not worth as much 10 years from now because costs have gone up, right? So we want to make sure we're understanding that inflation can really impact some of that conversation. Now, when we're developing the spending plan, we also have to make sure we're meeting those immediate needs first, right? It has the future component, but if we don't take care of ourselves today, we're not going to be taking care of ourselves tomorrow. So take care of those immediate needs first, right? And then use those SMART goals that you put together to see which one you'll pursue based on the available resources that you have. And then from there, you want to make sure you're evaluating the results periodically, right? You want to make sure that you're looking at it, that, your goals are still something that are, you want to actually achieve, that nothing has changed or anything like that. Really important to make sure you review these so that it's not a static document. This is something that's dynamic and has to change as you do. Now, one of the tools to kind of help do this, right? And there's several out there. You can use things like an app. You can use things like a spreadsheet, like we saw in some of those other options that are there. But iGrad has another tool available to you that's called their Your Budget tool. And it's similar to some of what we saw in the previous slides, those sheets, in that it's got the same areas that they cover as far as income and expenses go. The big difference here is that this is, again, dynamic. It's not something where you're plugging numbers in and getting a result at the end without having really gotten there to the end just yet. Instead, this allows you to make modifications directly within the iGrad platform to a budget should you should you care to share one. I didn't want to come out, I apologize. But to that end, I also want to make sure I say that, this isn't anything that's retained or shared with anybody. This is all personal to you if you utilize this tool. However, what you're seeing kind of at the top left of the screen where that star is, those are the different income and just underneath it, expense areas that you might potentially utilize. And they all have this preference option when you open things up. You can make adjustments to add individual expenses or types of income that you would have that maybe aren't listed here. You can keep adding new ones. And one of my favorite things that you can use this for is kind of sliding scale adjustments. So looking at your income side of things, right? Maybe you haven't necessarily gotten a job yet, but you've done your due diligence and took a look at some of that consumer information that's out there to find out what you may potentially earn later on. So you're going to slide things up and down to kind of see what your expenses might look like. Well, you can do that for these individual components, and it will automatically adjust that budget as you go. Right now, this person has a positive number listed there. That just means that the amount of their income minus the things that they are saving for, because again, savings is an expense, right? It's money you're setting aside that you can't use right now, even though it's yours. That can be helpful in also reframing not going in there and taking it when you didn't plan to, if you don't have to. But also your traditional expenses, and then how much you have left over, right? And if it's green, as you see there, it's a positive number. If it is red, that means there needs to be some adjustments, right? And it'll also show that negative designation as well. Now, in addition to those kind of, individual components that you can adjust there, on the right-hand side of the screen, you're seeing kind of these large-scale adjustments that you might potentially be able to utilize, right? One of the ways that this can be really helpful is, let's say you're going to be moving for work or whatever experience you're about to pursue, and it's not going to be necessarily as high a cost as we currently experience here near New York City, right? For those of us that are near campus, because it's expensive, right? This will let you go through and kind of on a larger scale, reduce the entire amount of all of these expenses that typically represent a certain amount within a person's budget, right? So you can kind of get an idea of what your income, if you put that new income in there, would be at a lower cost of living, right? So that's a really nice thing to do as well. My favorite part, truly and honestly, is what's at the top right-hand side of the screen. So goal setting, I think, is one of the more difficult sides of understanding how to do things with budgets and spending plans, right? It's challenging. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, so we can't really say for sure we'll get there. iGrad lets you go ahead and actually develop your goal directly within this tool. There's a section where you can click Add Goal. It'll ask what type of goal it is, okay? From there, if the one that's not there, the ones that are there listed aren't the ones you're using, of course, you can modify it. They'll ask you how much you've already got towards that goal, if anything. If not, you can put 0. What your ultimate amount is to be at the end where you achieve the goal, right? And then lastly, when you hope to achieve it. All of those things we just talked about in SMART goals, right? So when you put that in, it will ultimately make the adjustment for what you need to set aside in your budget in this tool. And if for some reason that puts you at a point where that goal isn't realistic, you're going to see that something looks negative in your budget, right? Instead of it having that positive designation, it'll be listed as negative. And that tells you two things. That tells you to do one of two things. One, you either need to adjust your goal, whether that's a time thing or the amount, whatever it happens to be, or you can readjust some of your other income and expenses, right? So if you have expenses, maybe you're spending a lot in one area that you're willing to sacrifice for this goal, you can make that adjustment right here and see how that makes a difference for you. So this can be really helpful if you've never gone through the process of trying to develop a spending plan or a budget before, because it gives you a way to do it with a lot of visual components that help build the important information directly into the tool. Now, the last piece of this, as I said before, sticking to it, right? Going through all of this, we've got the self-reflection component where we're looking at the income and expenses and why things go the way they do and what we need to learn about ourselves in that process, where we want to go. The only way we can do this really well is to sit down, self-reflect, and ask ourselves, how did it go, right? How well did we stick to the plan? How did we struggle, if we struggled, or did we succeed? I do think it's important to make mention that this isn't about pointing out what's wrong. This is about putting out information, right? If you struggle in one area, let's say you went over budget, you didn't, spent more than you intended to, but you were really successful in another area and stayed on track. Well, what can we learn from that one area to apply to the other? Or maybe we've gone through this and see that we have a lot of extra money at the end of the month, right? Well, what again can we do with that? We need to make some adjustments if we want to make that money work for us a little bit better than just sitting in maybe a low interest rate account, like a checking account or a savings account. In doing this, it gives you this sense of control, right? It's a process. It's not going to be fun the first time you do it, probably not the second either. But as you go through it, you're going to feel like you have better control and understanding of some of the things that can influence your money, like the stimuli that can potentially put us in a place where we're a little bit less than ready to act the way we know we should. I have that problem. I'm a little impulsive. But we can also then control the decisions that we make and how we respond to certain circumstances, and then ultimately control some of the consequences that come with it, right? One of the things that I can struggle with personally is if I walk past a coffee shop on my way to work, I'm probably going to want coffee. That's just how I am. It's how I like to start my day. For that reason, I actually went out of the way to get a tumbler and keep it with me so that I felt really silly walking into a coffee shop, but I'm only bringing the coffee I needed with me. And I'm not paying the amount that I might pay at a more retail location, right? I'm not just putting myself in a position where I'm not spending. I'm finding a resource that made my life a little bit easier. I don't have to leave as early because I know I'm gonna have to sit on a line for coffee, that kind of thing. It's about finding areas within your own experience that you can make meaningful change in. Now, one of the really great tools that's available in iGrad is what you're seeing on the screen. This is the Your Money Personality tool. What this does is it asks you a couple of really simple personality-based questions. And in doing that, it provides about a 40-page booklet or so of information related to the way that you may engage with your finances based on those personality questions, okay? You're actually seeing a snapshot of mine. So you'll see here, I was told that I'm a bit relaxed with my, just in general, right? Because this isn't explicit to finances, it's personality questions. And I'll tell you, I am. I like to think it seems that way as we're chatting today. And that's very much the case. So that didn't surprise me at all. It surprised me how accurate it was, but it didn't surprise me that they thought I was relaxed. To that end, they'll tell you how you might compare to other people that have used this assessment before more generally. And they'll also show you where you may have some opportunities using your strengths and where you may have some challenges as well, right? It's, again, not just about where we have challenges, it's about what we do really well. In that sense, you'll see here the biggest challenge that I had is that I can be a little susceptible to things like end cap marketing, right? If something is at the end of the aisle and it looks like it's on sale, even if it's not necessarily on sale, I'm way more apt to buy it if it's at the end because that impulsivity kicks in a little bit, right? That's very true. Now, on the other side of that, I'm also not afraid necessarily of risk, right? And when we talk about risk with finances, the thought that comes around to most people immediately is investing, right? Things like stocks that have some level of risk associated with them. Now that can be a good thing, right? It means I'm not afraid to, pursue an opportunity that I find to be financially beneficial, which can be the case for some people. They're more afraid of losing their money than pursuing that opportunity. But at the same time, the risk isn't always a good thing, right? We want to make sure we're doing that without the impulsivity that comes into the earlier part of the conversation. And to that end, they actually give you recommendations based on the information they provide to you on what you might do to enact some changes, right? For this example, I got told I should probably slow down and take a beat before I buy. Absolutely, right? Especially during the pandemic, I put this into place. For me, I started to notice I was just having things shipped to home really, way too much. All the brown boxes were kind of piling up everywhere, and I felt really bad for the gentlemen that do our recycling here. But that was happening for a few reasons, right? One, I was a little stressed out. That's the pandemic, and that certainly can impact the way our finances go. Two, it's really easy to buy things online. However, if I don't need it now, which is the implication of buying something online, I don't have to buy it now necessarily, right? So what I got in the practice of doing is putting things into my cart and then stopping and not actually making the purchase for at least 2 days, the amount of time it would typically take to ship, right? In doing that, I can then go back to that cart and look and see, one, if I put it in there, do I still need it to accomplish what I was hoping to accomplish at the time? Or two, why on earth did I even put it in there? Is that something I need to bring home, right? And I can take it out without actually having made the purchase, but still having that feel-good experience of doing the online shopping. So again, this is just examples of ways that you can use this information to make this meaningful to you. It doesn't have to be the way I use it, but I'm hoping the experiences can help you see how you can kind of look at the information and then apply the context to your own experience. All right, so we're going to take a bit of a detour from the budgeting side of things for a second. Given that we are approaching the tax deadline for federal taxes in the US, that's in April, I thought it would be good to kind of talk a little bit about taxes more generally, some basic information to assist with better understanding them. And in addition to that, giving you resources for some of the other things that you might be interested in learning more about. Okay, now first, what exactly are taxes, right? I think most of us know it's something we have to pay, but more explicitly, they're fees imposed on individuals or corporations in order to finance federal, state, and local government activities and programs, right? So the idea is what you're paying towards it is supposed to help the areas in which you engage. They can be assessed at a few different times. For example, sales tax would be at the time of purchase in most cases, okay? Not necessarily things like a car, that could be later. Now, there's also things that can be taken directly out of our income, like payroll taxes as well, right? Now, as far as who imposes taxes, right, and who is responsible for managing the way taxes are ultimately, responses, or how you're supposed to respond to your tax obligations, excuse me. The IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, is the tax collection agency here in the US, and they administer the Internal Revenue Code. Though it is enacted by Congress. So Congress tells the IRS what to do, the IRS figures out what Congress wanted to have happen and sets up a way to do it. As far as the federal side of things go. Now, state, county, regional, and city or other municipal offices may also have similar types of tax liability, depending on where you live, right? Not everybody's going to have every type of tax that we list on here, but these are some of the ones that you may experience. Now, some common characteristics of taxes, which sounds so strange, right? Taxes aren't people, you don't think about them that way, but there are certain taxes that can have certain ways that they are applied, right? Now, a proportional tax or a flat tax, you may hear that as, it's a tax rate that stays the same for all tax base, and tax base is just the amount of taxable income somebody has. That just means, again, the way that it's assessed is going to be the exact same amount for anybody that lands in the same place as far as the brackets of income that they have. We also have what's called the regressive tax, and that's a tax rate that decreases as the tax base increases. That is, people with higher base amounts pay a lower percentage of the base in taxes than those with lower base amounts. So as it sounds, regressive is exactly that. It means that as the income goes up, you may be liable for less. And again, that's one way that taxes can be assessed, but the good news, that's not how it works in the US. Yay, we use what's actually next on the screen, something that's called a progressive tax, okay? It's a tax rate that increases as the base increases. Now, what that means is that as you get to higher levels of income, you'll see different amounts of that income taxed at different percentages. The last actual amount that you get taxed at is called your marginal tax rate. Wherever your income lands in the bracket, that's what that is. Now, to touch on a few other types of taxes, sales tax that's added to the cost or the good or service that you are purchasing. And again, that's typically done by a state, city, or a local municipality that's not at the federal level. It can vary by location and by the type of, ultimately what you're purchasing, whether it's a service or a product, whatever it happens to be, right? There are some states that do not have sales tax, which can be really interesting. And there are some states that don't have some of the other taxes that we're about to talk about here, like property tax. Property tax is annually assessed taxes that are based on the value of your home, okay, or the purchased particular real estate item. They're typically collected by city or county governments. And that amount that you're responsible for is going to be based on the location that you are paying the tax to. Annual personal property taxes may be required on other valuable personal property you own, things like vehicles, a mobile home, motorized, things like watercraft, aircraft. So again, property is the greater sense of property. It's things that you own that you would potentially have to pay tax for. And then the last tax we're going to touch on this particular slide, this is excise tax. And this is a really interesting one. It's applied to certain goods or services, and it's typically shown as part of the price you see for the product or service. I'm going to kind of age myself a little bit, but I remember when we started to see really, really big hikes in the cost of things like tobacco, cigarettes, for example, that ultimately is an excise tax. You're not paying, a small amount for the actual product, and you see a big amount of tax that you're responsible for. It's built into the overall cost, okay? Now, Kind of moving on to our earnings and our gains, some of the taxes that we may experience, and these are typically assessed potentially at the federal and state or local municipality levels. Federal income tax is the primary tax that affects most people, and the amount is based on the earnings or the gains that you have. When we talk about earnings and gains, earnings are really just, it's the income earned from work, okay? And there's different types of ways you can earn money in that sense, but if you're working for it, that's typically what we call an earning. Now, gains on the other side of that, those are income earned from investments, okay? It's those more, I won't say passive opportunities, but not something you physically had to put labor of some type into in order to get that particular amount of money sent to you. Now, FICA taxes and payroll taxes, those are used to fund Social Security and Medicare for employees that pay into the system. It represents a total of just over 7% of your gross wages. And as most of us may know that have gotten a traditional paycheck, the reason that we have a gross amount on our paycheck and then a lower net amount is because that's taken out at the time that we get paid, right? That ultimately gets sent off. Now, the other side of that is that we're not the only ones paying it. So you can feel a little bit better when you see it. Just as much as we're paying for it, our employer is also responsible for paying an equal share of those expenses for FICA in particular as well. Now, on the other side of that, we also have self-employment taxes, right? Now, again, these are going to be used in very much the same way as those FICA taxes we just talked about and the payroll taxes, except this is for self-employed individuals, right? What that means is they don't have a traditional employer in which is going to do, that matching kind of concept, right? Instead, they're responsible for the full amount as far as paying the tax. However, they can deduct 50% of those taxes when they actually file their tax return. So it kind of evens out so that there's not a whole lot of detriment one way or the other. And then lastly, capital gains taxes. Those are based on any earnings that you make by selling an asset. So things like real estate, stocks, or other valuable items. Again, you'll see capital gains taxes and the concept of gains that we talked about a few moments ago. That's where that kind of bridges together. Now, a few other items that you'll probably see in relation to taxes, right? First and foremost, your gross income, right? It's a phrase that we hear a lot. What it really is it's the income you receive that isn't explicitly exempt from taxation under the Internal Revenue Code, right? That money we have that is just what we actually earn. Now, taxable income, the portion of your gross income that's subject to taxation. And that's a function of three different numbers, your adjusted gross income, deductions, and exemptions, which we'll touch on in just a moment. Ultimately, the tax rate that you experience determines how much of the difference between your income and deductions will be taken away, and deductions are a percentage-based thing that we'll touch on in just a moment. And then lastly, I want to make sure we explain a little bit more about what adjusted gross income is, because we've got gross income, taxable income, and then adjusted gross income. They all kind of sound like they live together. Adjusted gross income is more explicitly related to your actual tax form and your taxes on an annual basis, right? The idea here is your taxable income is your income minus specific adjustments, but before applying those deductions, things that can ultimately reduce the amount that you're responsible for paying, right? That's exactly what a deduction does. It reduces how much of your income is subject to tax, where deductions lower your taxable income by the percentage of your highest federal income tax bracket. So the idea being, basic concept here is that there are ways to potentially reduce the amount of your actual gross income, both in the amounts of what you're subject to being taxed on and in some of the other ways that we can reduce that using things like deductions. Now, basically, the way deductions work, okay, they lower your taxable income by the percentage of your highest federal income tax bracket, as we said before, right? And what that really equates to, if you were in, let's say, the 22% bracket, right? Basically, there's a couple different classifications there. And without getting too heavy into the tax component of things, you'll see kind of the actual allocations for each one listed if you were to look at a chart. And I will put a resource in there for you for the most current ones that are available so that you have that after the session. But let's say you find that you're able to utilize a deduction of $1,000. What that would really do is going to save you $220 in tax liability if you are part of that 22% bracket. Okay, so instead of it being a line item you can automatically reduce based on the amount of the actual cost that you pay, you have the opportunity to do it based on a percentage. Now, when we think about deductions, there's a few ways to think about them. These are all associated with things you do with your tax return, right? We may have heard the standard versus itemized deduction language floating around that context. Standard deductions, very simply, are a fixed dollar amount for a deduction that reduces the amount of your income tax. And again, it's based on your filing status, right? So in addition to the income component, the way that that standard deduction or the maximum amount that it could be is going to be related to the way that you're filing your taxes, whether you're a single or married filing separately, married filing jointly, or are a qualifying widower or head of household. The IRS actually has some really great resources on the differences between all of these because there's a lot of nuance to tax law and tax policy in order to really understand where you would fall in this category. But again, I will share resources on that so you could take a look and see, one, what the most current numbers are. I didn't have a chance to update the numbers on this slide before we started today, but I will make sure I do that before I share this with everybody. And two, kind of what your experience might result in, okay? Now, the other side of that, right? Standard is exactly what it sounds like. Just this is your filing status. This is the amount that you can deduct. However, you can also look at doing what's called itemized deductions, right? That just really means instead of taking that standard amount and saying, I'm going to utilize that standard deduction amount, I'm going to look at the explicit costs that I had and my individual deductions and what actually that comes to. And I will do that so it's explicit to me. So it varies from taxpayer to taxpayer, right? For some people, it's worth doing that. If, let's say, in an example here, we have somebody who's single, if the standard deduction is $12,550, using the numbers we have here on the slide, and they go through the process of kind of analyzing it on an itemized capacity, they might see that that number is more than $12,550, in which case you might have a better opportunity utilizing the itemized deduction to reduce your tax liability. However, if you saw that it was under that $12,550, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense necessarily to do that. You'd be in a position where you're ultimately, not taking as much benefit as you could based on what anybody has access to. So that's just to give an example of how those two things work and where you might see it. So one of the things I wanted to point out here, this is actually an example of one of the courses that are available in iGrad. And iGrad has a bunch of different courses available. I think they just went to 31 in the last week or two. So really good stuff there. But this one in particular is related to understanding your paycheck and W-2. And it's really indicative of what most courses in iGrad look like. Any course that you go to there is going to have a synopsis, more about this course, what it actually is. They'll also give you kind of learning objectives and roughly what you're going to need to see within that course experience, right? And how long it'll take. You'll also notice that it talks a little bit about the level of the course here as well. iGrad offers within those 31 or so courses up to they have different levels that you can participate at, whether it's going to be introductory, like we're seeing here, intermediate or advanced. So if you have familiarity with a topic and you want to better understand it and just see kind of what more you could learn, some of those advanced courses can help you do that. Or if it's something you're just not terribly familiar with, you want to start with some of the more intermediate or introductory courses, you can do that. But the best part, truly and honestly, is that what they do is this course will not be the same for everybody. Each one starts off with a pre-assessment, no matter what course you're taking at what level, to gauge two things. One, what you already know about this topic, so they're not engaging you with things that you don't necessarily need to learn. And two, what experiences around this topic actually apply to you, right? So you're getting information that's really, really tailored to your individual circumstance. Lastly, after you go through the course, that also gives us a chance to talk about knowledge gains, right? We can see exactly how much we've learned as far as a percentage goes by taking this course, right? If we had, let's say, we knew about 80% of what we needed before, we might see a knowledge gain that brings us to 120, right? So you get an idea for the level of learning that you have as well. Now, this is actually a tool that's available through iGrad as well. And it starts to kind of bring in this concept of the type of employee that we are may impact the way that we ultimately get paid, right? We saw an example of that when we talked about the way we're responsible for things like income tax and payroll tax, because a self-employed person or an independent contractor, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a business of your own, but you may not be paid as a regular employee. That's what an independent contractor is. You'll see that you have different tax, obligations in relation to what, a typical employee might have. You're just paid differently, right? So one of the tools to help understand kind of the more traditional employee pay scale in that context is this this particular tool here, okay? This is how do payroll taxes and deductions affect a paycheck, right? It's a long name, but it's a good tool. What it does is it lets you go through the process of entering kind of your more specific information, roughly what you expect your salary to be, how often you get paid, where the job is located, and that one gets to be important, right? If we think about that, states are going to assess taxes a little differently each one you go to. It'll let you choose the filing status that you plan on and any allowances that you have. And if you're not sure what that is, each section has a little kind of thought bubble that you can pop up and learn a little bit more to see how it applies to you. In doing that, they'll give you an estimate of what your net pay might look like as a traditional employee using the information that you provided. So this can be really helpful as we start to plan for that job prospect that's coming our way. Let's say we get a job that's in a different area. We're not sure how our taxes are going to be imposed. You can put what you expect to be earning and see what you might actually receive as a result of living in a certain area. So this is a really, really nice tool if you're kind of looking to better understand, a job offer that you're getting and what it actually means as you start to get paid. In addition to that, I have linked on this slide a resource to assist with locating a tax professional, because this is very much just the tip of the iceberg in relation to taxes, right? It's important that if you have questions, you know where to go. So that's going to be a great resource to help you out as well. All right, so moving back into this conversation of thinking about tomorrow, right? Taxes do that for us, right? Being aware of our taxes is important because it helps us understand in the greater context how much money we're going to need to pay or have at any point. Taxes ultimately are a result of having purchased things or having a liability to the area that you live in. So we talk about it in the context of transitions for that reason. Now, the other side of that is then how do we start planning after we understand some of our financial obligations, right? And this is the case for whether we're going into another semester, another program, or we're getting to a point that we're ready to start going into our careers. The first step is you want to make sure you're developing a spending plan, right? And we talked about what they are. However, this is important in two different contexts, right? You can, one, as a student today, understand how much you can afford to pay for key items, or if you might need additional funding as a, potentially a student loan, something like that. And this also applies afterward when we add the context of repaying a student loan, should we have one, right? This is important because student loans may have different options for repaying them. Including different repayment plans that may be based on income. So if you're going through this process to understand the after component of things, you want to make sure you look at what you can afford to pay so that when you elect into a payment plan, you're choosing one that makes sense for you, right? From there, we want to make sure we're actually evaluating any student loans that we have, reviewing them and monitoring them, right? Even if we're not necessarily at a point where we're ready to graduate, okay? The reason for that, money that we don't actually see go anywhere can be a little unfamiliar, right? It's not tactile. We don't understand it the same way. And that's why, unfortunately, if we're not looking at the amount that we've ultimately borrowed, it can start to get really, really high without us ever really noticing it. So this is, again, something that you want to make sure that you're doing so that you have a chance to actually track the amount of money that you're putting towards your education. Again, one, so that you don't borrow more than you need to, right? Take a look at what you have and, what you can afford to repay later in that context as well. As I mentioned before, look at the different repayment options that are there for you. Of course, you don't want to ever, put yourself in a position where you're paying less than you can actually afford to by choosing a repayment plan that's based on income. However, they're there for you to utilize if you need to do that. It's better to have a payment plan you can adhere to than one that you can't, that should have worked out if you could have. You want to make sure you're putting your spending plan in action. Good practice, right? Both as a student and later, making sure that you go through and review it as need be, and then knowing where to go if you need help, right? Especially in the context of student loans, whether federal or private. Or if something happens, we want to be prepared for where we can get help for that. Now, the first way to start talking about our finances in the context of student finances is, we think about how much we're borrowing. We don't understand some of our costs, one of them being your cost of attendance, which we'll talk about in a few slides. You can consider some of the other options you may have as far as reducing your costs, like making payment towards your education now that doesn't have interest associated. With that being said, you also want to look for non-repayable fund sources. And with this, I have a really great resource, iGrad Scholarship Search Engine. If you're still going through the process of going through your academic study, this can be a really helpful tool in looking for scholarship opportunities in a really aggregate way with really good foundational and well-checked information. It's a really simple tool, and I actually have a little video on how to use it put together that'll be linked in the presentation as well. So cost of attendance, right? We're talking about this concept of accurate projections here. This is something that is really helpful for those of us that are going through the educational experience. It represents an amount that we may pay as a student or expect to pay as a student for a certain period of time while we're in school, okay? And it's made up of a couple of different things. What you're seeing at the top right-hand side of the screen, that's kind of the more common expenses that are actually in your budget, right? Things like housing, utilities, transportation, food, medical insurance, all of that stuff. Well, good news, that's in our cost of attendance as well, right? Not all of it will be. Things like recurring memberships or subscription costs won't necessarily be in there. They're not school expenses, right? But if you're looking at a way to plan for your school costs, you can use this cost of attendance information to integrate into the greater expenses that you have, right? You can look at some of the things, for example, we have what's called indirect costs, and that's something that represents things you don't necessarily have to pay to the school, but you do have to pay to go to school, and that's made of things like your housing, your transportation, right? So it can be really helpful in understanding what those costs may be if you're not sure how much it'll ultimately cost over time to be in school for a certain period. In most cases, you'll see it presented with an award notice that you got from the financial aid office, though it is on the websites as well for your financial aid offices and the University Student Financial Services website. So those are linked here for you too. Now, the way that that information ultimately is derived is through what we call the Consumer Price Index. And I started to talk about that a little before. The idea here is the Consumer Price Index ultimately will let you see, based on percentages, roughly how much a basket of goods have gone up or down in cost over a certain period. In addition to that, we also have what's called their Occupational Outlook Handbook, right? Now, what this does is it gives us information related to certain types of occupations for long-range planning. For example, roughly how many people ultimately are in the job now and roughly the median pay that they have, right? So if you're not sure how much you might earn, that can be a really helpful tool. It also talks a little bit about some of the outlook information for certain types of jobs, right? This was a snapshot for social workers. I had recently done a presentation at that school and talked a little bit about this as well. And we can see that this is what they would ultimately see for someone in that area. However, not everybody that works as a social worker will be called a social worker. There's several different types of versions of that. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see they do give you the option by selecting, this similar occupations button that they have to see some of the other areas that ultimately you may have a job fall into that kind of relate to this. From there, you can also go into actually separating this by state and area data so that it's even more accurate for you. You can look and see what you may be earning in the area you may earn it in. Now, to that end, as I said, we use that Consumer Price Index information, that basket of goods going up and down, really just cost over time. It's representative of inflation to make your cost of attendance, right? So if we were looking at our cost of attendance as a student, this is kind of what we would see, right? We can see kind of all those different categories listed there that fall into cost of attendance. And then we also see this information related to our student award offer, the money that we're being given at school, right? Now, as a student, we can use this to ultimately, with some of the tools we talked about today, like that daily income and expense diary for our own tracking purposes, and the simple budgeting worksheet over time, to see exactly how much we might need to borrow in a loan if necessary, right? If we go through this and see we don't have enough to meet our expenses, we ultimately then have a better idea as to what we might need to borrow. And this goes the exact same way, just absent the award notice, as we would do this typically in any other budget, right? This could just be your income and expenses instead of it being an award notice. And you can go through the exact same process using those tools, and that'll let you know if you need to make adjustments as well. Now, the next piece of this is going to be talking a little bit about student loans more explicitly. And when we talk about student loans, this is not just student loans for federal student aid. I know a lot of people kind of feel like those are the primary types of aid that we see. We're also going to talk about private student aid as well, on private loans in particular. Now, what exactly does that mean? Federal student loans, those are made available to students through the Department of Education. Where private loans are offered by private lending institutions, okay? That means kind of, what your local bank may be offering, or if you went to, a website and applied for a loan through a student loan specific lender. Those are all consumer products, which means they fall within the same kind of rules that credit cards do and home loans do and things like that. Now, federal student loans typically do not require a credit check. There is one exception for any type of plus loan you may be applying for, but it's not your standard type of credit check. They're looking for really specific things there. Where private loans is more the traditional experience, right? They're going to look at your specific credit information, and if you have one, a co-signer's credit information, which is somebody who would be assistively responsible if you weren't on your loan. They'll look at that credit information to determine if you're eligible, okay? Now to go with this, I also have a resource that talks about the types of federal student loans you may see if you are ultimately receiving federal student loans, so you can better understand how they're different from each other, and that'll be shared with this presentation too. Now, interest rates, right? Federal student loans are offered at fixed interest rates based on the date that a loan is first dispersed, or otherwise said, sent to the school on your behalf, right? So the federal student aid office goes through and puts out what those interest rates are periodically based on when your funding is sent to the school. So you may still see a bunch of different interest rates that apply. What you won't see is that they change over time. That's the difference, right? Now, private loans, interest rates vary. Now, when we say vary here, it doesn't explicitly mean that they are variable, which means the rate can change over time. This means that it's going to be different depending on the financial institution, who's applying, the terms and conditions that you're being offered, and whatever factors that lending institution decides are important to them. That being said, these do get offered at both fixed interest rates and variable rates, so that's something to watch for as you apply. Now, as far as repayment options, federal student loans have several repayment options that meet kind of the unique and diverse needs of each borrower that they ultimately work with. And they can be utilized as long as you are in good standing, that you're not delinquent, right? Where private loans may or may not offer alternative repayment options, it's going to, again, vary by lender. The best thing you can do is read the terms and conditions that go with it. That being said, during the pandemic, even though, they didn't have to, some lenders that were private loan lenders did go through and have little periods of relief for people to assist given the circumstances. So you don't want to assume there may not be help. If you want to go more than just looking at terms and conditions and have questions, reach out to the lender. That's what they're there for. They'll be happy to tell you. Now, again, I mentioned before, you want to make sure you know what you borrowed. This sounds so trivial, but if we don't look at it every once in a while, it can get to be some really, really uncomfortable numbers without us noticing it, right? For federal student aid, you can do that by going to look at the student aid summary on file for you at studentaid.gov. Studentaid.gov is the website where you do everything for your financial aid that's related to the government. So everything's all accessible right through there. They actually have a really great tool called their Federal Student Loan Simulator that'll help you kind of approximate what your costs might be under several different repayment plans, as well as your goals, right? Do you want to simulate more borrowing? Do you want to go through the process of looking for the best repayment strategy for you? Or even if you're just struggling with your loan payments, they can assist you with this tool going through and kind of guiding you through the process to see what options might make the most sense for your goals. Now, private loans, on the other hand, there's no actual central database to monitor all of your domestic-based private student loans. That being said, if you applied for private student loans with one lender year over year, they'll typically have some type of system you can log into and show you that information, right? They'll have that. However, what that doesn't do is tell you what that looks like in the greater context of your credit, okay? You want to make sure that you're looking at your credit report for that. One really good example of where this could be helpful is if something happened that wasn't accurate, or if something disingenuous happened, right? If, in an instance of identity theft or fraud, somebody has created a loan for you with a lender that wasn't the one that you were using before, you wouldn't notice it unless you looked at that credit report. So it's really important to do that. As far as interest rates go, I have listed here the current interest rates associated with federal student loans, depending on the type of loan that you have. You'll see very small, but it's there. 4.99% is the direct subsidized and unsubsidized loan fee for our undergraduate population, where for unsubsidized loans and plus loans for our graduate population or parent borrowers are at 6.54 and 7.54 respectively. This is where you can start to see the date component of things. This is July 1 to July 1. That lets you know when that's applicable to. And there's also information here related to some of the fees associated with federal student loans. Now, federal student loans that have fees don't feel like they have fees. It's something that kind of happens at the borrowing level. Let's say you borrow a $10,000 loan, the school will get a certain amount less than that, and that is how you wind up paying that fee, okay? Now, this is, again, important because you want to make sure you know how much you're borrowing, but you also want to know how much you'll need to pay over time. So being aware of those rates and fees is extraordinarily helpful. Even though we're not talking about credit in this session, I do have resources here related to understanding credit reports and scores to help you get a better idea as to review that information, what that might look like, and how to use credit cards responsibly. They actually added another credit-based course relatively recently as well. So some really great credit-related information in iGrad. Now here, this talks a little bit about how interest is ultimately put together on federal student loans. And the same concept often applies to other types of loans, though it may not happen in the exact same way. First and foremost, we're going to talk about what's a simple daily interest formula. This is how they determine how much interest you're ultimately going to pay over a period of, 30 days, really since your last payment. And they use something that's called the interest rate factor. Basically, it's just a way of taking the total interest rate that you have and putting it down onto a daily level. And I have a really nice example of that I'll share with this presentation. Now, it's important to realize with federal student loans, there are certain circumstances where the interest associated with your loan will be, quote, capitalized. Federal student loan payments are designed so that you are paying principal and any interest accrued on the loan in your payment usually, which means you're already doing the benefit of paying the interest, right? They build it into the way that those are repaid. Now, there are certain times where they're going to take anything that's accrued and just boop, put it into the principal, which means you're going to be paying more over time. And there's a resource here to talk about when that happens. It can be certain types of repayment circumstances if you're doing, changing a payment plan or maybe even consolidating a loan, which means kind of putting them all together into a brand new loan. So I would definitely recommend looking through that to better understand that component. I do have in here a little bit of information on how you can look at your account history information with your credit report. Again, for private loans in particular, this is really important to make sure you understand how to read it. They show you the different types of accounts that are listed there and kind of how you might see what's being represented on the report, whether or not it shows that you were delinquent or not. And again, even if we're not talking about something related to something disingenuous, sometimes our lenders will inadvertently report that you may have missed a payment, right? And you don't want that on your credit report. It can make big sweeping changes to your credit. The biggest part of your credit score they make it up of a couple of different components. Most of it's your payment history. So payment history is really important to monitor, and you wouldn't know if they inaccurately reported that to the credit entity without looking here. So I definitely recommend reviewing this slide. And with it, I'll have even more information kind of on the basics of credit so that you can look through some of that as well. Now, there are several different federal student loan repayment plans, as well as other options for temporarily postponing payment as well. Right now, there are 9 different repayment plans you can choose for federal student loans. So we're not going to go through all of them today, but in here, you can kind of see what the Federal Student Aid website has and how they can show you the information related to each one. So it'll talk about the name first and foremost of the plan, who can potentially utilize it, and the repayment term as to what you might experience for it, which types of federal student loans can use that plan, and then some helpful tips, right? For example, this standard repayment plan, that's just a fixed amount over 10 years. And if you don't choose something else, it's the one that you'll ultimately fall into. There's information that shows you, well, you'll usually pay less over time than under some of the other plans. That makes sense. Some of the other ones, as we could see based on these names here, like income-based and income contingent, they're based on your income and they can potentially extend beyond that 10-year repayment term. That makes sense that you may pay more over time. It's a balancing act between what's reasonable for you to pay versus the amount of interest you're willing to pay. You have to look at those options. And the good news is you can change these over time, right? So even if you wind up picking a plan that ultimately maybe isn't doing the most for you as far as paying interest right away, but it's what you could do based on your circumstances, that's okay. If you get to a position, you have a new job and you're ready to start doing some more payments, you can change that plan as long as you're in a good place with your loans, you're not delinquent. Now, you also have options just for temporary relief, like if you have a problem that you need just a couple of months to get situated, those are called deferment and forbearance, and they qualify under certain conditions. With that being said, the last thing you ever want to do is if you get mail and you're just not ready to pay the bill is just to toss it to the side. And there's some really big reasons as to why. That's where we get into things like delinquency and default. Okay. Delinquency, and this is the case in general for private loans as well. The first day after you miss a student loan payment, your loan becomes delinquent and remains delinquent until you repay the past due balance or make other arrangements, right? So you do still potentially have a chance to maybe change your payment plan if you're a federal student loan borrower at this point, okay? However, be proactive. You're better off doing it beforehand because the more that you're late, the more interest that can accrue, right? We look at that amount as far as the interest rate factor. If it's a daily kind of thing from the last time you pay, the more time between your payments, the more it can accrue. So that's kind of why you want to make sure you're doing that on time. If you're delinquent more than 90 days or more, it will be reported to all of the major credit bureaus in the US. That's Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. Now, again, this is important because our payment history, as I mentioned, is the fundamental thing that builds the largest component of our credit score. And that is directly related to how much we are charged to finance something, whether that's with a credit card or whether that's, a mortgage, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so if it winds up being reported onto your credit, you could see some negative impacts there. With that being said, there's also the chance that you may have some difficulty obtaining some of the less credit-based things we think about, like utilities, homeowners, or other types of insurance, a cell phone plan, being able to rent an apartment. And that's because these entities often will do a credit check before they ultimately either turn on your service or are willing to provide you the apartment, things like that. Okay. Now, the next component of this, it goes beyond delinquency. We're going to start talking about default, right? What default is, it's a period of non-payment at which time you have a much larger consequence associated. In the case of federal student loans, this is at a point of at least 270 days. For private loans, it's going to be dependent upon each lender and product, but it should be in your terms and conditions. And on the federal side of things, these are on the right-hand side, some of the consequences that you can experience. We have the credit-based consequences we saw with delinquency, right? However, there's some other really severe ones, right? For example, the entire unpaid balance of your loan and any interest you owe becomes immediately due. That's called acceleration, right? And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but that means you have a lot more to owe right now. It also impacts your capability to continue utilizing some of those benefits that you can as a student loan borrower, things like deferment of forbearance, those temporary postponement options, or choose a different repayment plan. This gets to why it's so important to do this ahead, right? That proactive component, so you don't have a problem later on. If it goes for that 270 days, you kind of limit the way that you can resolve the issue, though there are ways to do it. That's not to make this seem hopeless, but there are ways to do it. Absolutely. Now, the other side of that is you can have your taxes and wages garnished as well. You might not be able to purchase certain types of assets, and there could be court fees and legal ramifications. So just to kind of put that out there, it's important to make sure I mention that as well. The whole idea is to be proactive. We just don't want to get to a place where we do not know how to solve the problem. Now, I want to end with this, right? This is really important in that we want to make sure we understand this time and money concept really well, the reason for it. And talking about things that we owe versus some of the money that we hope to accumulate and the goals that we have are the reason and the whole focus of this and how they come together, right? Compound interest in some ways can be fantastic, especially if you're the one benefiting from it, right? Basically, it is interest that earns on interest. That's why when we hear about people making recommendations as far as investments go, they say the sooner you do it, the better, because time really does help in that process. Now, on the other side of that, if you owe money to somebody, it's still the same conversation, except it's money that you're losing, right? You're giving it to somebody else. And this example can really help illustrate how a little bit can go a long way. We have two individuals that are starting with a zero balance in an account, and they are both expecting a 5% return on an initial investment of our gentleman, $50, and the lady that we have here, $150 each month. So they're starting both at zero, and every month they're going to invest just different amounts, right? Starting at 20 years old at that zero, we then move to 30, and we see that the gentleman has $7,750 accumulated, where the woman has $23,249. Now, of course, we would prefer to be the lady here, right? It's a little bit more money. But both have made a substantial amount of good returns on this just based on the small amount that they put in at the onset, right? The thing that really makes a difference here is time. So as we go through each decade until we get to about 70 or so, we can see that this is compounded in a way that we now have 6-digit numbers for both individuals. The gentleman is $128,985, where the woman is $386,956. And they did nothing but the exact same thing over the entire period of time, right? So if you're looking for ways to start the process of saving, this should be, a call to action for you in that it's easy to get started, right? Even if it's not $50, if you can put $10 away, the act of doing it is going to get you into the habit of doing it. And that habit is the important part over time. This also goes the same way for those debts that we have, right? We want to make sure that we're looking at that long-term outlook. Things like paying minimums can certainly compound the issue because interest accrues. If we can avoid that, we want to make sure we do it. To that end, though, that is going to be the end of the presentation for us today. I do want to make sure I open up the floor to any other questions that may have come through while we were chatting. All right. It's not a have to. If anything comes up, I actually do have some really great contact information slides to share with you. That's what we're seeing here. To go with it, some of the resources that I also have are related a little bit more to some of the potential forgiveness programs that are out there for federal student loans, should you qualify for them, as well as information related to the pause on repayment that's currently going on, and kind of the resources on where you can find out what's going on as far as the Supreme Court decision that's being decided upon, still in progress in relation to student loan debt relief. In addition to that, you'll see there's a QR code on this slide. That ultimately will give you the chance to go to a video that shows you how to use iGrad. It'll walk you through the entire process, including creating your account. It'll show you kind of how to use some of the tools that are in there. They're the most popular ones, so strongly encourage you to do that as well. If you have questions, please do email me. Like I said, my favorite thing to do is talk to students. That email address, financialwellness@columbia.edu, goes directly to me. I am happy to have you reach out. But for now, I think we actually had one question come through. Can you speak to the distinction between single and head of household, or is that considered tax advice? I can speak kind of more generally to it, right? Head of household has to do with certain qualifiers that are tax advantaged, right? It typically will change the amount of tax that you're being assessed in your favor if you can do head of household. It usually has to be that you have 50% of the expenses more generally associated with your primary residence. Being part of the component as to whether or not you can choose head of household. The other side of it is if you have what they would say is a dependent, somebody you are responsible for, typically more than 50%. So with that being said, there are only certain people that can qualify for that status with those conditions. There are others, of course. Again, as not being a tax expert, I can kind of give that limited component on it. But in single, that's kind of everybody else, right? Somebody that isn't married necessarily and just has this one specific, they're just not any dependents, or they may even have dependents, but maybe don't own a home. That would also be somebody that's single, and they are just taxed at a little bit different a rate in most cases. It's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Awesome. Were there any other questions that I might offer to assist with while before we wrap up for the day? All right, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to my colleagues in University Life then to finish us up.
Awesome. So, of course, thank you to Tristia and Student Financial Services for sharing their time and experiences with you all today. I just want to remind everyone that today's event, again, is a part of the Graduate Initiative for Inclusion and Engagement. This is only one of a series of events throughout the semester. And to learn more about upcoming events, be sure to check out our events calendar, which has also been included in the chat. And I'd also like to extend a big thank you to everyone who attended and participated. We hope that you were able to gain a lot from today's workshop.